From fitness routines to mental resilience, navigating personal goals to tackling burnout, we could all use a little help being human. And that is what the Life Kit podcast from NPR is here to do. As I'm sure you've noticed, life does not come with a manual, but you still have to make choices every day, some big, some small, and these shape the direction of your life. Well, Life Kit delivers strategies to help you make meaningful, sustainable change. I personally am still in summer mode over here, and lately Life Kit has been really delivering with advice on how to improve your grilling or make a salad for your next picnic, how to beat the heat on a humid day. Ice towels, people, ice towels, they really make a huge difference. But of course, even when you are in summer mode, life still presents much thornier issues, and Life Kit has recently done episodes on preparing your home for possible flooding, staying out of credit card debt, making hard decisions together with your spouse. I promise, if you go to the Life Kit feed and take a scroll through the topics, you will find something that will help with a dilemma in your life. So go ahead and check it out. Listen now to the Life Kit podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan, and we are technically in our late summer break on the show. Nicole Hemmer and Kelly Carter-Jackson are gearing up for a new school year, but we had to break the emergency podcast glass a little bit to talk about the latest developments in the Trump administration's efforts to reshape the way in which we tell history, including, just this week, increased attacks on the Smithsonian and attempts to reframe the story of slavery. So here we are, and we are doing this for our newsletter subscribers first. Newsletter subscribers, you are getting early access to this conversation, and that is because we are really trying to make our newsletter the home for all the coverage of America 250, the larger issue of how we do history in the Trump era, and so forth. So here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Thanks for popping off your late summer break and having this very fun and stimulating conversation.
No problem. Hello, Jody. Hey there.
And to prove that we are in late summer, both Kelly and I'm not in New York City, I'm in the Hudson Valley. Both Kelly and I are dealing with lawnmowers and leaf blowers outside our window, which is a very late summer vibe. So there you go.
It totally is.
So look, shout out to our newsletter subscribers. I just want to say real quick, and anyone who's listening to this after we put it out into the world, you should consider subscribing to the newsletter since, as I said, that's where we're going to be doing a lot of more exclusive stuff there. And you are also, being presented with a chance to help support our coverage of America 250 and so forth. And, as we're going to discuss, the work of history could use some funding and some support these days. So go ahead and become a subscriber to our newsletter where we're doing America 250 Watch and conversations like this. Anyway, I mentioned that the latest development is this increased pressure on the Smithsonian, these remarks about slavery. We will absolutely get into that. We have thoughts on that, but let's lay out the larger context and the backstory. We've done an episode about this before, but a lot of this, Nikki, goes back to this executive order. Everything in the Trump era goes back to an executive order, but Trump did sign this executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. The basic idea there is wanting to celebrate American greatness more in the way we tell history, but, kind of what is that sort of ambient context that leads us to this particular moment?
One of the things that Trump has been obsessed with, especially since 2019, 2020, but I think it's always been a through line with his political career, is this idea of restoring patriotic history, that there should be a kind of state-sanctioned history that glorifies the United States. And that kind of, frankly, just rubs away all of the tough places and all of the hard places. And that has been so clearly part of his agenda because there has also been, coming out of academic history, scholarly history, and even journalistic history, this real push to kind of come to terms with some of the darker corners of U.S. history. And Trump is trying to use his power as president and power he does not have as president to run over curricula and cultural institutions in order to enforce this new history that he wants to celebrate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the 250 has brought out a lot of feelings.
Boy, has it.
I know. And part of that is that I think historians and certainly museums have always been trying to get the story right and to be a lot more inclusive when they tell the stories of like who are the heroes and courage and valor and how we think of like the origins of the United States, and be much more honest about that, not just inclusive, but honest. And I think that there's power in telling a story as it was. And sometimes that makes people feel uncomfortable when it goes against sort of the, I don't know, heroic, sort of like romanticized view that they have of the United States.
There's another element here that I don't think it's either or, but there is the kind of, do we tell history that acknowledges the tough parts of our history? But then there's another element that you often hear people in Trump orbit talk about, which is kind of just like the effect of telling that on an individual. And there's a little bit, part of this make history great again is I want to stop feeling bad when I'm told about my country's history, and to put it in blunt terms, like I don't want to, as a white person, I don't want to be told that it's my fault and that I should feel guilty for what happened in the past. And, I think that's a kind of, that's on you. That's a misreading a little bit of the work of history. No, it's not trying to make an individual feel guilty, but I do think that's part of it, and I don't think it's ever just one or the other. But that's very much, I keep that in mind as I think about the motivations behind how they talk about history.
I'm not convinced people feel bad. I'm not convinced that people go to certain places or see certain things and then are bummed out for the rest of the day. I just feel like that is misplaced. Certainly, you can see an exhibit on slavery and you should be gripped by that, and you should be sort of compelled to think about like the violence of what it was. But are people somehow like depressed afterwards? Like, I feel like that's just extreme.
You get this a lot. We saw this with tours of Monticello when they started to introduce slavery into the history that they told there, and people would walk away from it, and they would give this line that Kelly was just mentioning. It makes me feel bad, and it's like not bad enough.
Yeah,
it clearly didn't uncomfort you enough that you would like rethink some of the core reasons why it makes you feel bad, why you're having such a strong reaction to seeing this history. And I do think that emphasis on how the individual emotional experience, as opposed to the opportunity to walk away with this richer and deeper understanding of history. It's not that museums and cultural spaces shouldn't evoke an emotional reaction. I think they should. But that that sort of issue of personal discomfort, or frankly, personal anger at not being able to hear the more comforting version, that takes such primacy is fascinating.
Yes. And the fact that we never consider, or I should say rarely consider, how African Americans or Native Americans might also be feeling about their own history and context in which they're viewing and interacting with these sites or images or objects. So, that's never considered. Because if I were to look at something, say from Harriet Tubman, and have an immense amount of pride about that, I think that has to be considered too, but it's not taken into account.
And I mean, when we talk about what is taken into account, basically whose feelings matter here, I mean, it is, really in a sense, like a couple specific people who are in Trump's orbit. And this explains, to my mind, so much about Trump world, is just kind of like who has his ear at a particular moment and what are they up in arms about. And J.D. Vance is a huge figure in all of this. He was kind of named as as a member of the Smithsonian's Board of Regents, and I think is kind of in charge of stopping spending on exhibits that don't align with the administration's agenda. He has also had some very interesting comments about slavery in our historical memory, which we will get to. There's another person, maybe a little less known, a woman by the name of Lindsay Halligan. And she's actually the only person named by name in this executive order. And she is, no surprise, someone who I think Trump first came to know as someone who went on TV and defended her. She's got a legal degree. She's very telegenic. And I think the backstory, I mean, sometimes you say these things and you're like, there's no way this can be true. But I think the backstory is that basically she came to Washington for the first Trump inaugural, or was visiting D.C. during the first Trump administration, went and saw some museums, as one does, and saw a few things that kind of got her up in her feelings, right? And she just happened to have the ear of Trump's inner circle. And now all of a sudden she is kind of being name-checked as one of the leaders of this pushback against the quote-unquote woke ideology within the Smithsonian and museums and how we teach history in general. And she has said, I think there should be more of an emphasis on how far we've come since slavery is one of the things that she has said about the way we teach history. But Lindsay Halligan is a name to have in mind as someone who I think is kind of behind a lot of this.
What I kind of like about that is that she actually says, I think there should be more of an overemphasis on how far we should come from slavery.
Oh, yeah.
And that sort of like little misstep is like, yes, you do think there should be more of an overemphasis on how far we've come from slavery.
Yeah, let's tilt the scales the other way and not just even the scales. Yeah.
But I mean, one of the things I do appreciate about what I call the Blacksonian affectionately is that it's not, when you go into the museum, sure, slavery is definitely there, as it should be, right? But that's not the totality of the Black experience in the United States. So when you're on, the third or fourth, or I think it's 5 floors, 5th floor, and you're looking at, technology, or you're looking at, Black astronauts, or advancements in medicine, or the arts, or music, or, all of these different iconography of like Black pop culture, like that is not the sole experience when you go into the Smithsonian, or the Blacksonian, I should say. But that's what people tend to harp on the most.
Yeah. It's so interesting, right? Because so much of that museum is about joy and celebration, and it gets reduced to, and then these sort of public conversations coming out of the Trump administration and the right to, they talked about slavery and it made me feel bad, which is so reductive.
Right. And so there is one part of the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. I think Blacksonian is a lot easier and funner to say. But there is, one exhibit that in 2020, in the first Trump administration, got a lot of people up in arms, which is a kind of exhibit about whiteness. And it talked about whiteness as a cultural force. And it sort of, and I think a lot of people, including like the Ben Shapiros of the world, pushed back against that. But I do want, and we can bring this a little bit to the remarks of just this week and these kind of latest developments, which are talking about the Smithsonian directly and putting pressure on the Smithsonian directly. But I'm kind of struck that the African American History Museum isn't specifically being called out here, right? I mean, Trump is not railing against that museum. J.D. Vance is not railing against that museum. They're railing against the Smithsonian in general, or museums in general. And so, and moreover, in 2017, first Trump administration, Trump said, quote, "I'm deeply proud that we have a museum that honors millions of African American men and women who built our national heritage, especially when it comes to faith, culture, and the unbreakable American spirit." So, part of that is just, I think Trump world feels more unleashed to say what they've always felt these days. But yeah, like, what is it, Nikki, about the information environment around Trump that they're not saying this exhibit at this particular museum is problematic in this way? They're more just kind of like angsty and railing.
Well, I mean, part of it is that it's just pure uncut emotion. And that's the media environment we live in, right? Like, what is it that will get the biggest reaction? What is it that will get the most attention? And so, as we'll talk about later with the slavery comments, like, he found all the right words to key in on that would absolutely trigger a reaction. I also think, I mean, as far as his earlier comments, like, Trump also has like the good Black view of race, which is like, he certainly has Black people who he thinks of as good Blacks. And that's sort of like, Hank Aaron in the Garden of Heroes. But I think the broader thing is specificity probably wouldn't help a ton and might hurt a little bit in this case. But also, I don't think Trump knows the difference between the Blacksonian or the Museum of American History or Natural History or American Indian, or that there's going to be a museum to American women or to Latinos and Latinas. Like, Trump doesn't work in specifics.
No, Trump doesn't even know who Frederick Douglass is, who's making a comeback. You know what I mean? He does not know history. Not really. He knows, like, talking points. He knows broad strokes. But when you start to tease things out with not just him, but anybody in his administration, a lot of their arguments completely fall apart because they are just completely unaware of, like, chronology, narrative, like what took place, who's who, why. All of that stuff is missing.
Yeah. And I know she'll come up later, but Jillian Michaels showed up on CNN one day and was talking about these museums and all the bias. And she later posted on social media, she was like, this is the exhibit I was talking about how it makes like, Cuban freedom fighters all about like American imperial policy. And it doesn't say anything about any of that, right? Like it is just a sign that explains that the U.S. meddles in Latin America, which is just a fact of U.S. Latin American relations, as we've talked about constantly. And so, I mean, there certainly are things that they zero in on, like they'll find like that one thing, and the whiteness exhibit is probably one of those that they're able to make a lot of hay of. But like an in-depth kind of examination that sits on the bounds of factuality. That's not the media environment we're in.
Yeah.
We're in the one that is like the gotcha images.
It's like reacting to a tweet of a screenshot of a rumor, not a comprehensive review of whatever.
No nuance,
Hey, this is David Rind. I'm an audio producer at CNN. And one of my favorite things about working at CNN is that I can call up our super smart correspondents and reporters whenever I want to pick their brains about the news and the stories they're covering. Well, I want to bring you in on those conversations with our podcast, CNN One Thing. Each week, I grab one of those said reporters and we break down one big story that's been making headlines. Again, the podcast is CNN One Thing. Listen on your favorite podcast app.
As summer winds down, I'm all about refreshing my wardrobe with staple pieces for the season ahead. And Quince nails it with luxe essentials that feel effortless and look polished, perfect for layering and mixing. I recently went and picked out a couple pairs of slacks, a light jacket, because that crisp fall air will be here before we know it. And then I was looking around the Quince website and I noticed a section I hadn't seen before: kids. I'm not sure if this applies to you, but oh my gosh, my kid is going back to school soon. And not only that, they grew over the summer. That always kind of sneaks up on me. Well, luckily, Quince has stylish and affordable kids' clothes, so I quickly snagged a linen overshirt, a pair of kids' jeans, and even some new running pants. They also have kids' backpacks, by the way, just a tip. So, whether for you or whoever, elevate your fall wardrobe essentials with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. So let's bring it then to this moment right now, to what's gone down in August of 2025. So I want to read you Trump's quote from earlier this year, or from earlier this month, just a couple weeks ago, where he says, quote, "We want the museums to talk about the history of our country in a fair manner, not in a woke manner or in a racist manner," which is what many of them, not all of them, but many of them are doing. "Our museums have an obligation to represent what happened in our country over the years, good and bad, but what happened over the years in an accurate way." Reaction to that?
That is an incorrect summary of what he wants.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, but it's so interesting, right? Like you could take that sentence, strip Trump out of it, amend it just around the edges and say, yes, we want an accurate, comprehensive history that tells about the things that we still want to celebrate and the things we kind of want to run from because they're so awful. Like, that sounds amazing. That's what a museum should be doing. But then you have to like layer over that. Well, what is the history that Trump would like to see in these museums?
Yeah.
And it is not that, right? Again, I just the importance of the emotional response that a white conservative will have walking in this museum is the penultimate, or not the penultimate, is the primary factor in deciding which branch you take when you're telling one of these stories or putting up an exhibit. Like, would a MAGA person like this? Is the decision point not, is this accurate? Is this fair? Is this representative? Is this helpful for people who are trying to understand our nation's history? And that seems to be really big asterisk to that statement.
And I mean, he won't say this, but all of this is about very much a revival of the lost cause, very much a revival of changing names of military bases back to Confederate soldiers, bringing back statues that had once previously been taken down, like trying to redeem, as they did during Reconstruction. All of these Confederate lost cause ideas is what Trump wants to see more of. And anything, I would say, that is Black or of color and progressive, it points at all of the fallacies and all of the racism within their own coalition. So they don't want to talk about those things.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I'm kind of surprised that it took this long for the conversation to distill very specifically down to the legacy of slavery, since that's probably been what it's been about all along. But, you know, it was finally this week that it burst into the open, this specific idea of kind of how do we relitigate what slavery was. And so I want to get to that. But, you know, the reason I mentioned J.D. Vance at the beginning, in part because he's, you know, ostensibly at the head of a lot of this Smithsonian review. But, you know, J.D. Vance is someone who has a long history of thinking about the Civil War and slavery and its role in our history and its role in our cultural divides. You know, J.D. Vance has actually argued something we've argued a fair amount on this show, that like the Civil War never actually ended. Now, the sentence that J.D. Vance places after that claim is very different from the one that we place after that claim. But, you know, J.D. Vance, going back years, has talked about how, you know, he feels like this dynamic between the elitist North and the sort of salt of the earth South never really went away, and that the South has always been trying to vindicate itself. You know, the lost cause mythology sort of bubbles into that for sure. And then just a couple weeks ago, Vance was on Theo Von's podcast, and he kind of went out of his way, and I saw it at the time and I was surprised it didn't get more pickup, but he went out of his way to say, and I'm quoting here, "I think something happened 10 years ago where you were told to think that every person who fought with the Confederate side in the Civil War was an evil person." So he's clearly thinking not just about how do we tell history, but very specifically about what do we do with the people who fought in the Confederacy. He's talked also about, when he's trying to talk about kind of who makes real Americans, he's talked about people whose ancestors fought for the Confederacy have more of a right to being real Americans than immigrants who came here 10 years ago. So he's really refracting a lot of his thinking through the legacy of the Civil War.
Yeah, and by obfuscating slavery, by ignoring slavery, you don't have to deal with the Confederacy as a problem, because if you take slavery off the table, within the Confederacy, it's just some poor white Southerners that have been done wrong and are victims to Northern aggression. I mean, like, you can completely tell a different story if you are not talking about slavery as the sole cause of the Civil War, which we all know it just is. It just is. Like, that's not even debatable among historians, among people that know even a little bit about history. But changing that narrative, I think, is what's so important. And it just highlights to me, like, how much, too, we have not at all dealt with the issue of slavery. Like, I think it was Isabel Wilkerson and others who've talked about this, about, like, we've been a country with slaves longer than we have been a country without slaves. And it's going to take like another century or two until that fact changes. And so until you reckon with that and really grapple with, like, what does this mean and how do you repair that harm, we're going to keep coming back to people who want to erase and erode that history, because it requires them to be accountable to something that they just don't want to be accountable to.
Yeah, and it's such a, I mean, with Vance, it's such a clear lost cause logic, like, that the victims of the Civil War were white Southerners is, I mean, it's something that you would have heard from Pat Buchanan in the 1990s. You would have heard across the U.S. South. It's what was taught in textbooks, history textbooks for much of the 20th century. So it's not that there's not a long history of that idea. Obviously, there is. There is something about the past 10 years that's intensified in this moment, where we're getting to the root of things very explicitly in the language. And that can be a good or a bad thing, right? On the one hand, it's like, okay, well, let's talk about it. If this is really about, are Black people human beings? Is slavery a good or a bad thing? I guess it's good that we're talking about that. But at the same time, like, when those extremist views are put at the center of the conversation, one of the things that we're seeing is that then everything sort of shifts to the right because that becomes a valid question.
Yeah.
Where it, at least in polite society, in mainstream society, those weren't considered okay questions.
Yes.
20 years ago, and now they're at the center of the national conversation because both the president and the vice president would like to relitigate the question of, well, what about the good parts of slavery?
But let me just highlight that progression, because that is really the sort of Rubicon that was crossed, I think, this week. So it's one thing to say we don't teach history the right way, and then you put a finer point on it and say, well, the Civil War was really not about slavery, right? To your point, Kelly, it's kind of like there's been long time efforts to sort of switch the grounds of the conversation. But this week, what happened was the next step, not just let's not talk about slavery. It's actually, let's talk about slavery and let's actively talk about whether it was as bad as we are told it was, right? So Trump tweets or posts on Truth Social just this week, the Smithsonian is out of control, where everything discussed is how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, and how unaccomplished the downtrodden have been. Nothing about success, nothing about brightness, nothing about the future. And then his, proxies, his minions, go out on TV and start talking about this and start kind of injecting this question of how bad was slavery into the discourse. But I just want to highlight, that's different from saying, hey, we should stop talking about slavery. We got to get over that. What does it mean that we're now actually relitigating?
Yes, and trying to minimize it. I mean, and that cue Jillian Michaels, who comes in and basically
can you tell us who
says,
Jillian Michaels is? Because I got to say,
God.
I don't really have a cultural framework for her.
If anybody watched The Biggest Loser back in the aughts,
2002.
Yeah. And it was a show in which they brought on contestants, a reality show, to lose weight. And, they started off with 30-something people and went down to one. Whoever lost the most amount of weight was the winner. And they had these trainers. And Jillian Michaels was sort of like, if there's a good cop, bad cop, or a good trainer, bad trainer, Jillian Michaels was a bully. She railed against these contestants. She, diminished them. She demoralized them.
It was dehumanizing. It
was dehumanizing. Yeah. It was absolutely dehumanizing. And it's funny because I've watched that show and you look back on it, man, it does not age well. It does not. You want to talk about body shaming? My goodness. So that is how Jillian Michaels comes to fame, to prominence on this widely popular reality show. It's funny. I used to watch The Biggest Loser while eating ice cream and popcorn. But the crazy thing about it is they had her on a CNN show with Abby Phillips, which my first question was, CNN, why do you have this person on? Why have you given her a platform and a microphone? I don't understand why she is here. I don't understand what she has to offer. But she's at the table. And while she's at the table, she basically, out of left field, starts to become an apologist for slavery and to say that only 2% of slaveholders, of people owned slaves, and it
of
was
white Americans. Did you know that only 2% of white Americans owned slaves? Did you know that slavery is over 1,000 years old or thousands of years old? Yeah.
What?
Jillian Michaels has been on a journey, and I won't go on a long tangent about this, but she has moved through sort of the MAHA space, right? The Make America Healthy Again space, that sort of alt-right, wellness to alt-right pipeline, and has become just this reactionary right-wing figure. She goes on Joe Rogan, Megyn Kelly, she's deeply anti-trans, and so she continues in that bullying persona, and so she does well on these platforms that elevate that in the algorithm. And so she goes on there and she's just every single thing is oh, no, this is all because white people bad. And that's just not the truth. But the fact that she put slavery at the center of that to try to minimize it, to try to say white people aren't responsible for this. It is one of those,
apoplectic, but also what? It was this is the lowest, like, you did not, this is so unnecessary. Like, this whole conversation was so unnecessary, but also rife with fallacies. I mean, like, we know that slavery was the biggest thing going, and we don't like to talk about slavery in the North, but like almost everyone owned an enslaved person, like one or two people, almost everyone owned someone. And so, the idea that slavery was not as big as it was, the idea that slavery was 1,000 years ago just doesn't track.
Or that it wasn't as horrific as it was, which I think is the most dispiriting part of this conversation. I think, it's long been a kind of talking point in white supremacist circles that slavery was not as bad. The conditions was not as bad as people portray it to be. And I mean, I think there's very little distance between those sort of darkest circles and the people who are in power now.
Yes.
But that's the part of this that has bubbled up. Whereas I tend to think, like, actually, any idea that you may have of how bad slavery was, it was probably much more
worse, way worse. And I don't know, like, what is more disturbing, the fact that she's making these claims, the fact that she has also adopted a Black child. And I'm like, what values are you teaching your Black child about slavery? Like, so much of this was just completely upsetting. And I even thought about like I don't like giving people who make outrageous claims like this attention, but at the same time, when people say things that are so egregious, you just feel like you have to respond, because stuff like that will catch on and people will be like, oh, it wasn't that bad, or oh, it was only just a few people, and excuse the entire system as people being, exaggerating claims about slavery.
There's such strong parallels with Holocaust denialism, too. And it's the kind of thing that in like 2015 or so, like I'm seeing in Breitbart comment sections, I'm seeing on like Gab and other far right spaces, VDare comments, things like that, which are, for listeners, are just these very far right places on the internet that have now become. Now you're seeing them on CNN. Now you're seeing them sort of referenced in presidential posts.
They're getting legitimized. They're getting a platform. Yeah.
And they're getting embedded in the conversation in a way that I wouldn't say it was unthinkable 20 years ago, but it's stunning to see the sort of things that were in the dark corners of culture get dragged out and become more acceptable.
Yeah. Which is why you have to respond, because you didn't have to respond when it was fringe. Nobody, whatever. No one cares. But when it's on CNN,
and it's on CNN as a proxy for, the thinking within the administration. But yeah, just to highlight, I sort of said this before, but just to highlight kind of that shift of the window of what's acceptable thought. I think the traditional argument when you're trying to relitigate, for the traditional conservative argument when you're trying to relitigate the Civil War was, let's get over it. Let's stop talking about slavery. It's been long enough, and now it's not that. It's no, let's actively relitigate it, and so there's the shift. But look, I want to start to wrap up, but we just spent those last 15 minutes talking about these ideas. We didn't mention museums. And as I was thinking about it, I'm like, is this actually about museums anymore? Like, how does this tie in? If we're asking fundamental questions about slavery, and how bad it was, and how widespread it was, and how sort of critical it was to the development of this country, is that really about what's going on inside a Smithsonian? I want to bring it back to museums if it's there, or maybe it's about something else.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and if we think about it as a piece of all of these different cultural and political institutions, universities that are now getting rid of Black studies or trying to change syllabi and having presidential interference in the kinds of content that's being taught about slavery, about the Black experience. Now you're seeing this pressure be put on museums, and you're seeing pressure be put on media organizations, all of those things coming together. I don't think the Blacksonian is going to have how bad was slavery really exhibit anytime soon. Like, if it does, boy, have we moved quickly. But if you're able to tamp down on the real story, then that just creates much more space for this pro-slavery or slavery apologist argument to take root. with less pressure pushing back against it. So it is about museums in that museums, like universities, are kind of countervailing forces against this argument. And that's why they're under attack, because there is real power in the stories that they tell.
Yes, absolutely. Outside of, public education, K through 12, libraries, reading, museums are a public space that shares a lot of the public trust that people go to, and they expect to sort of see something that will tell them about the past as it once was. And I think people have a lot of faith in museums for the most part, and because a lot of them, at least at the Smithsonian, are free and widely available for people to get to. When you start to mess around with public trust, when you start to feel like these huge institutions across the country are no longer trustworthy, will no longer give you the story as it is, I think that has a huge shift in how we understand anything as truthful or as honest or as real. Messes with a big part of our psyche.
Part of what you're saying, and I think part of what we're seeing happen right now, is clearly also a question of just like, what are museums for? I think that there's just, and it's what are institutions for? What are universities for? Right. And we just reran this episode about the founding of the Smithsonian, and those questions were being asked at the time then, is this a teaching institution? Is this just like a collection of stuff, with no story? Is this sort of, a way to preserve our history? Is this sort of actively telling a story? Is this for kids? Is this not for kids? So, those things have always been contested, and I think those things have shifted in recent years. And I think a lot of the pushback that we see from the right is because those things have shifted. This question of what is a museum for, what are institutions for? Funnily enough, when we reran that episode, I went back and I listened to it, and it largely holds up because it's just about the founding of the Smithsonian. But at the end, I actually sort of talked a little bit about how I was surprised. And we recorded that 2 years ago when Biden was president. But, but after the first Trump term and at the sort of peak of the anti-woke conversation, and I remarked how I was a little surprised that the Smithsonian hadn't become a target of some of this stuff at that point, that people weren't railing about how woke the Smithsonian was, that people weren't talking about defund the Smithsonian in the way that they talk about defund NPR or whatever. I had to edit that out before rerunning it. I mean, usually I'm like,
evidence that you spoke this into
usually I rerun the episodes and I'm like, this existed at its time or whatever, but it sounded so off base given just how things have shifted in the last 3 months, that yes, now it absolutely is a target. So on that front, we're not going to answer this question, but how do you see the Smithsonian behaving right now in reaction to this, and how do you see a path forward given all that's gone down? And I feel like we're just at the beginning of the sort of ratcheting up of pressure. But where do we stand?
I think that, and maybe this is me being an optimist or whatever, but I do feel like we underestimate that museums are still part of a bureaucracy, and that they're not bulletin boards where you can just take down a picture and put up another one. It takes a lot of time to not just dismantle an exhibition, but to put something up to replace it. And so I remember I sat on, this consultant board for the MFA in Boston. This is probably like 2023. And we were thinking about how to re-envision an American exhibit that they had. And I said, when is this going to go into, place? When can the public see it? And they're like, 2028. And I was like, 5 years from now. And because it's not easy doing this kind of work. It's not quick. It's not Canva. It's not like where you just sort of move things around. And so even if there are to be changes, I would still expect those changes to be slow. At least changes that we hope or they expect to be permanent are slow to put into place.
And I think that universities are a good sort of model for what to expect from these various institutions. Like, some of them will capitulate in advance. That's something that we saw with the National Archives. A big controversy over the last summer was that they were, going around asking, do we have too many Native Americans in this display? Is showing the patent for the birth control pill too controversial now? And then I think you might see in the Smithsonian some exhibits being shelved for a while, maybe taken down, maybe roped off. But it's hard to imagine them being able to pull together new displays, especially given what I would imagine would be just incredible internal resistance.
Yes.
So I would imagine, in addition to like the folks who want to capitulate in advance, there will also be people who are very strategically dragging their feet at a bunch of crucial points in the hopes that this is something that if they survive the next 3 years, they can return to normal. I don't know that that's the case. I think that's pretty optimistic, but that's probably the strategy that I would adopt.
Yes, slow roll everything.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that is largely what's going to play out, though. I mean, there have been. I also don't want to downplay the kind of chilling effect and the attempts to comply in advance.
Right.
You know, and there have been reporting that like 32 exhibits at the National History Museum just sort of disappeared, or the Museum of American History disappeared. And I certainly think this America 250 stuff is going to be under sort of deep review. And, you know, that's been coming together for a long time, but that's happening next year. And I think that's getting magnified in ways that we've talked about. And I think a lot of those exhibits are going to either be catered to the Trumpian audience or come under review and see material changes. But I will say, you know, the sort of flip side, downside, maybe even silver lining side to the fact that, as we said at the beginning, so much of this griping about museums is not about a sort of comprehensive understanding of what they're up to, but just like this one exhibit got screenshotted and tweeted at the right person who happened to be in Trump or JD Vance's ear at the right time, that like there's nothing you can do in advance to prevent that. Like if they want to find something to have a get up in arms about, they will. And so in a sense, that's freeing in that, like, what are we going to do? We just kind of have to maybe just fight each fight as it comes up individually, but there's nothing you can actually, I just don't see something that the Smithsonian could do that counts as like mollification or compliance, right? Yeah. If people want to find something to be up in arms about, they will. And so I guess I'm going to live in that reality.
Yeah. I'm a consultant on a 250th exhibit. And one of the questions that I asked them, because they were like, how do we navigate this particular political environment? And I was like, are you worried about good faith criticisms or bad faith criticisms? Because the good faith criticisms we can talk about. The bad faith criticisms, A, you can't protect yourself from, and B, if you try, it's going to result in just a very poor exhibit. And I think that's the right mindset for going forward is like, what are you going to care about? Obviously, the media environment means bad faith attacks can still damage you a lot. But I just don't think that there's anything you can do to safeguard yourself against those.
No, especially if you're trying to do the right thing.
But what about like flying under the radar, which I think a lot of people are thinking about? It's like, we're going to continue to do our thing and we're going to be proud of our work and we're going to do good work, but we're just not going to try and stick our necks out and not try and get on anyone's radar. There's a lot of that going on, right?
Yes, there's tons of that going on.
There's a lot. There's a lot. And I mean, I hate to say it, but even this whole debacle is still like, you know, keeps us away from asking questions about the Epstein files and keeps us from like, you know, getting at the other much more pertinent and problematic issues that are buzzing around today. I mean, like, I do see some of this as distraction.
Yeah. And yet so important that you can't not talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, shout out. We haven't mentioned this person's name, but shout out to Lonnie Bunch III, who is the secretary of the Smithsonian and is in the crosshairs of a lot of this, or just trying to help make a lot of these decisions. And
hold it down, Lonnie. Yeah. Hold it down.
Yeah. Or at least just like hold on until some other distraction comes along. And try and fly under the radar. But yeah. All right. Well, look. When I saw that this was the story of the moment, and, you know, we have a show with two actual historians who think about this stuff, I knew we had to do the emergency podcast, even though we are, in theory, on our late summer break. I know the two of you have lots to do to gear up for this coming school year, but I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and I appreciate everyone listening to this and subscribing to the newsletter and being part of this sort of ongoing conversation about how we tell history in the Trump era. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Radiotopia.